President Trump appointed you in 2017 as U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, and uh, and a role that you held until January of 2021. Could you explain in broad strokes the scope of the mandate and share some of the most important lessons and challenges from your diplomatic experience?
Thanks, Jose. Happy to do that. The scope of the mandate was global. It was on the topic of Article 18 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the one that declares and states, and everybody agreed to this, that you would have religious freedom to be able to do with your own soul what you choose and see fit. As a person of faith myself, this is central to me that people have that right, that I have this right to use it as I see fit. It's also just fundamental and foundational to the United States of America. This country was founded by people that came here looking for religious freedom. The pilgrims initially in coming here were looking for a place they could practice their faith in freedom. So it's really in the DNA of this nation. It's our First Amendment, where you have the right to practice your faith freely, and the state cannot create a state church to force you to be a part of it. So they did it really in two parts there. They said that there'll be a separation of church and state. The state will not create or own a church. And on the second part of that is that you have the fundamental right to practice that however you it, that you want to do, and that is your individual guaranteed constitutional right. So it's really foundational for us. But the mandate that I had and was given was a position. The position itself was created by Congress. It's an ambassadorial position that was statutorily created by Congress. I was in the Congress when we created it. And it was really to push this foundational right, which we were seeing eroding around the world and having difficulty maintaining. And we could see that just if you could get this right, kind of even half right, if you could kind of get that cornerstone set somewhat right, you could really build your other human rights off of it, and you could build this free society. And it is foundational to Western civilization. Western civilization is built on a Judeo-Christian foundation of the human dignity. Each individual is unique, is beautiful, is created in the image of God, and has individual human rights and freedom, has freedom. And this is just this foundational belief within Western civilization that we were just seeing eroding around the world. And we thought, let's push, let's put an ambassador there. The ambassador is to advise the president and the secretary of state on these topics and to press this forward. Then in the first Trump administration, Vice President Pence initially and Secretary Pompeo at the time, and then in his final 2 years in that first term, much more so President Trump saw this is a foundational right that we want to push. And we want to make it a central piece of our pushing forward to reclaim human rights around the world that had been in decline. And so you really saw the administration elevate it with ministerials of foreign ministers coming to Washington to talk about it, with a UN General Assembly event focused on religious freedom, saying we've got to get this one right. We've got to.
So, based on a testimony that you gave at Congress this year on February, yeah, it seems that China is one of the obstacles to furthering this notion of religious freedom, right? So, in the testimony that you gave to Congress this year, you wrote, an alliance of nations has emerged that see religious freedom as the greatest internal threat to their dictatorial control. Communist, authoritarian, and totalitarian regimes around the world are engaged in an unprecedented effort to control people of faith within their nations. This dark alliance shares the view that organized and emboldened people of faith must be effectively, if not brutally, suppressed to maintain their power. So, could you walk us through why it's the case that autocratic, authoritarian regimes they fear religious freedom and they try to suppress it, primarily communist China?
Yes. Jose, I've been at this work now for 20 years, off and on, in the last really 8 years full time, mostly full time on religious freedom. And yet the problem has gotten worse. And I kept wondering if we're putting more and more effort into it, the United States is putting more effort into it, Western societies are, why is it getting worse? Uh, it's like we've increased our activity triple, but the opposition has gone up tenfold. Why? And what I finally was able to look at and observe was you've got an alliance of dictatorial regimes led by Communist China that sees religion as the one entity within their country that could bring them down. That actually they have to have, the regime has to have their boot on their throat, or they could throw them out. And it's often in these places that the people of faith are the first ones attacked and the last ones left standing because of the nature of faith itself. It looks beyond this world. It looks beyond the regime, and the regime may threaten it, may brutally treat it, may imprison, may kill the people of faith, and yet they will still be there and fighting for this, what they believe is as a divine calling on them, and it's implicit really in almost every faith that's there. That it's this where I'm looking for a place beyond this one that I'm in right now. Uh, and so we just started seeing all these dictatorial regimes really increase in this area. And one of the conclusions I drew was that the fall of the Soviet Union and the satellite countries that it had developed, at its core, the fall was about people of faith. Initially, it was the Jewish refuseniks in the Soviet Union and the evangelicals. Later in Poland, it was the Catholic Church. And it wasn't even really the formal church, it was the Catholics, many of which who hadn't been to Mass or church in decades, but they still had that core of a core of an orientation. And so when Pope John Paul shows up in Poland and says, "Be not afraid," the regime crumbles. And I think the communists in China did their briefing and analysis of what happened to the Soviet Union and concluded you've got to get people of faith under your boot. So they went at it aggressively. And now you have surveillance technology that's perfected in China, that's the best by far the world has ever seen, able to find literally the needle in the haystack and then to prosecute that person that they find. So we were seeing this and saying, this is who we've got to fundamentally confront and stop really seeing religious freedom as a nice human right that we can advocate for when we want to or not otherwise, or to see it as one of many human rights, but to see it as a core issue to be able to build a free society around. So much so I've worked on this that I've got a book even coming out on it, China's War on Faith, middle of May, that we go through what the case is and that this is really the Achilles heel of the dictatorial regimes. They cannot stand a free faith system. And it's one we should clearly push in our efforts for a free world.
Thank you. And so you mentioned your book, China's War on Faith, and we see that there are many challenges emerging throughout the world. One of them being in Nigeria, right? So recently, you and I we talked about it. What happened on last Palm Sunday in Nigeria? So could you talk a little bit about Nigeria specifically? Because even though I mean, there's a we might even call it a genocide going on there. We see very little coverage by the so-called mainstream media. So could you please talk about Nigeria and other countries in the region that where you think that this is a critical issue and doesn't get enough coverage from the media?
Yeah. So on Palm Sunday, 2 days ago, saw 40 Christians gunned down in the streets that were out celebrating Palm Sunday. and just literally gunned down by radical Islamic jihadists in that situation, which is a second reason why I think Western societies, in particular, freedom-loving societies, have to stand for religious freedom. Because if you don't, you will see the clash of civilizations, which is really what you're seeing in Nigeria today, is a radical, fundamentalist, militant Islamic organizations, a number of organizations attacking another faith, in this case, Christians in that country, or in some cases, even moderate Muslims that they don't agree with. And my point in making this is that, again, you've got this issue of religious freedom. If religious freedom is the objective of the government to guarantee for everybody, it doesn't pick a religion, it doesn't pick a winner or loser, but it says to everybody, you have the right to practice whatever your faith is, and we will protect that right. We will fight to protect that right. We may not agree with the choice you made, but we will fight to protect your right. You can subdue that clash of civilizations. Civilizations are built on a religion. And you've got the area, the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa region, primarily built on Islam. You've got the European, US, much of Western Hemisphere built on Christianity, on that Judeo-Christian ethic. Civilizations are built on a religion. You will see Huntington's clash of civilizations if you don't have governments that guarantee this right of religious freedom, because these civilizations will clash. They will fight, and it will be bloody, and it will be brutal. And that, in my estimation, really is what you're seeing in Nigeria today, is this fight right in that middle belt of Africa. And you're going to see a big bloody fight throughout Africa if, again, you don't have governments protecting this fundamental right of everybody, not picking which religion, but supporting and fighting for the right.
And just so our audience has an idea, there's an estimate by the Holy See that today about 400 million Christians face persecution all over the world. And that's the case in Africa, but it's also the case closer to home in Latin America. So for those in our audience who are unaware of this, the US State Department publishes on an annual basis a report assessing the situation of religious freedom in multiple countries. So there are two countries in Latin America that are called countries of particularly concern, namely Cuba and Nicaragua. So could you please explain to us what the situation in Cuba and Nicaragua is these days?
It's in essence, you don't have religious freedom in those countries. And Nicaragua is one that's really taken this turn much harder more recently than Cuba. Cuba's been this way since it's been a communist regime. Communism is an atheistic governmental structure. It does not allow the position of anybody to claim that there is a God. And I guess you can claim it, but they won't allow people to freely and publicly practice it in ways uninhibited by the state. They'll let some people practice it, but there's limitations put on. And then Nicaragua more recently, and this I think really tracks with when they started lining up more closely to China and away from Taiwan, which is a fairly recent development within the last 5 years, that the Ortega regime just went much harder against the Catholic Church. And I assume, and I think what really took place was the Chinese Communist Party said, you've got to get the Catholic Church and the evangelicals under your boot, or they could throw you out. And they started much more aggressively going after the evangelicals, the Catholic Church. They kicked out a number of priests and bishops and pastors within the evangelical church, and even more recently started banning Bibles from being brought into Nicaragua, which is an old communist tactic from Soviet era. People haven't been doing that recently, but they're banning those coming into Nicaragua. So again, it's these sort of totalitarian, dictatorial, authoritarian regimes that don't countenance or want an organization that's not completely beholden or under their authority, which is generally a religious body, fits in that mold. One of the things, Jose, I want to point out to the people here on this call, this is fundamental whether you're a person of faith or not. And let me cite an experience in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led the civil rights movement in the 60s, really, in the United States. He was a pastor. He was a minister. He was a black minister, and he primarily organized within the black church. Not exclusively, but that was the primary kind of organizing place that they went to. And I've gone on civil rights pilgrimages to places in the United States. And it was the church that provided the organizational structure. That's critical to us having a free society. And here was a group that was oppressed that then had a vehicle and a way to push back against the dominant culture and against the government. That's part two of why you want religious freedom, is it gives that alternate structural place to organize. And it's been a very effective and key and important thing, even in places like the United States.
And even though this is not a country of particularly concern, according to the US State Department report, we know that there have been many difficulties between the Catholic Church in particular and the state in Mexico. So I'd like to defer here to my colleague Cesar. I know that he has a question on the relation between the Catholic Church and the Mexican state.
Yes, thank you very much, Jose. Uh, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for this talk. As we were talking previously, previous event, in Mexico, we are now remembering 100 years of the Christian war between the state and the people. So I would like to ask you a question in relation to that. In countries like Mexico, there is a historical tension in the relationship between church and the state. While the country is largely shaped by a Catholic cultural tradition, as you were mentioning, since the mid-19th century, there has been a strong push towards a secular state, partly as a reaction to past conflicts. In practice, however, this has sometimes evolved into a form of secularism that tends to exclude religion from the public sphere, unlike what you were mentioning just with the US. So how would you distinguish between a healthy secular state and a form of secularism that becomes restrictive of religious freedom? Thank you.
Good. It's a good question and an important distinction. And I just, as a background note, I belong to the Catholic Church, and I really consider Catholicism having come into the Western Hemisphere in Mexico. When Juan Diego sees Our Lady of Guadalupe, that is just everywhere throughout the Western Hemisphere, and so I mean, it's so odd to me that Mexico would have this difficult cultural state relationship with the church that was landed here for the entire Western Hemisphere, in my estimation, not exclusively, but and even in my own home state, the first Christian martyr in the United States was in my state of Kansas in 1548 when there was a priest that had come here with Coronado the year before and came back to proselytize the Indians, the Native Americans, and was martyred here. There's just this rich history and deep history and a loving history. I think what you see in a lot of places is, again, this effort by government. If we can't own the church, we've got to hold it down and suppress it because it's an alternate organizational structure that we don't control and we want to control. And I've been a part of government for much of my life, and government likes to control lots of things. That's also why our Constitution of the United States tries to limit government's control, because it's just this nature of government to do that. And I think that's what you see, unfortunately, in Mexico, is this effort by government to control things that they shouldn't control. People should be allowed to freely practice their faith. And then you also, I think, right today, you have really the difficulty of these narco organizations throughout the Western Hemisphere in places, but Mexico really has struggled with that. I watched the last election cycle in Mexico, and I think there was, if I remember that, there was dozens of politicians running for office that were killed while they were running for office. And as a candidate, I'm going, wow, I mean, I've got all sorts of people around me getting killed. So your tendency as a public official then is to go, well, either I've got to really confront these guys and be heavily protected myself, or I should just kind of try to let this situation simmer and I'm not going to try to upset things too much. And the problem with it is you do that, it just gets worse. You've got to confront these guys. You've got to go after them. And the United States is willing to be helpful. And I think there would be a number of other countries helpful too, but that can get in the way because those narco organizations then will attack the church too as an entity that stands against them and tries to help local people that they're living off of and selling drugs or moving people or whatever the case might be. They have to be dealt with. You can't just let it grow and hope it goes away and just doesn't blow up in your watch. I think Mexico's got a very difficult situation today. I really think they do. But I think it's one that can only be answered by confronting this demon.
Thank you. So far we have been talking about clear cases of religious persecution sponsored by the state, or at least the state lends private parties some kind of support. But we also see, particularly in Western societies, a different kind of despotism emerging, right? And religious believers, they are not necessarily persecuted, but there's a way that the state can use to make their lives more difficult. So, and you had the experience yourself with your organization. So in 2022, your organization's bank account was closed by JP Morgan Chase without any kind of explanation. So could you explain to us what the nature of your organization was and what were the events that led to that and what was the resolution ultimately?
What was the National Committee for Religious Freedom, which, in the United States, you're kind of going, how can you get a much more American organization than the National Committee for Religious Freedom? Maybe National Committee for Apple Pie might be seen as more American, but this is just fundamentally what the country was built upon. And we had the bank account open for about 40 days before JP Morgan Chase, when I went to put a deposit in it to get the account going, said the account's been closed. It was closed at the corporate office. Where that says non-revocable, and you're not supposed to say anything else about it. It was what the lady read to me off of the computer screen at the local office I'd gone to, and I was just stunned. But what it indicated was the thing you're talking about, what happens in Western societies, which is really, they don't generally tend to throw you in jail, although we've just seen a Finnish parliamentarian lose a case on hate speech that she could be going to jail about. They really try to suffocate you. It's a suffocation technique more. Either way, you're dead. But in that suffocating area where they just put a big wet tarp over you, they try to keep you from being able to participate in the public square. In our case, it was debanking. And when we went public with this, I had anywhere from 15 to 20 organizations get a hold of me saying it had happened to them too, but they had just been private about it. And they found another bank and we found another bank. And they just thought it was going to hurt them too much if they would fight it publicly. And I said, that's the very reason we ought to stand up for it, because if we don't stand up against this suffocation, there are other people that it's going to happen to them as well. And it can be debanking, it can be deplatforming, it can be de-insurancing, it can be firing your customer as an accountant because you're a pro-life organization. It can be situations where a community foundation gives to all sorts of charities, but not to ones that are in a disfavored group, like they stand for traditional marriage or they stand against abortion. We'll give to all sorts of groups, but not these nonprofit groups that are against the kind of cultural demands of the time. And that's what you tend to see taking place in the United States, in Western Europe, But we've got to push back against those as well and stand up and say we have a fundamental right to participate freely in the public square, in the public marketplace, just like anybody else, even though you may not agree with us about what we're standing for. And this serves Western societies well because what's kind of popular today may not be there in 5 years, or people may try it and just say, that just doesn't work. And by the same token, it may be something that you change the society, like I talked of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, and their changing of the society that we needed. And those are groups that really bring the agitation on forward to help so much. And that's why these things are needed. And we, instead of suffocating people, we should really work to accommodate various religious groups in any way we can so that they can robustly participate freely in all facets of the society. We were also, Jose, I want to mention one other thing that we're seeing, and I presume some other places are too, as in these accreditation entities, that they really kind of take a tact against foundational Christian beliefs in many cases that may go against the current cultural trends. And then they try to force Christian higher education universities or others to hoe to the line of the current cultural demands rather than to what their religious beliefs are. And this is a real pernicious one that I think people have to watch for and push back against.
In other words, you have to dilute your Christian identity in order to conform to whatever the culture is saying.
If you want to be a pharmacist, you got to give up this piece of your set of beliefs. If you want to be a social worker, you got to cast this piece to the side. And you're going, no, that's not accommodation. That's suffocation.
Yes.
And we're going to push back and fight against that on the grounds of religious freedom. One other real quick case on this is we have a number of Amish in the state of Kansas, my home state of Kansas, and some Amish sects don't allow their children to go to school past the age of 16. Now, I've got a doctor of law. I have a son who's a doctor. I believe in education. I think everybody should get an education, but I believe in their right to, okay, if you think people really should work more with their hands, and that's part of your fundamental belief that this is a way that you hope to organize your community to be able to reach the divine, we should reach an accommodation. And for a while, my state sued them and said, no, you got to go to school. And then they found an accommodation, said, okay, no, we'll let you test out of it as long as you know the material up into a graduation level. And that's what we ought to be doing. We are fundamentally stronger because we have Amish people in the United States and because we have Orthodox Jews that don't work on certain days, or we've got this community or that community. It helps us as an overall society and culture to accommodate people in those situations.
And I know that you personally believe that the U.S. government is a force in the world in order to promote religious freedom. So, could you explain to us what role do you think the U.S. government should have in promoting religious freedom and emboldening people's faith throughout the world?
I think we should make religious freedom a foundational global security issue, not a human rights issue. I think we should elevate it to a global security issue. I think it's a front and center issue for us in our confrontation with communist China and the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes that are aligned with it in the world. I think it is a fundamental issue for us into preventing the clash of civilizations that we're seeing take place in places, certainly in Africa, and you're seeing pieces of that in India and in other places as well. This is one of the key pieces. And we've got to get it out of the cul-de-sac of being a nice human right when you can do it, but it's not necessary, to know this is central to an interconnected world vision. And it's a completely diametrically opposed vision to what communism has, where the state is the highest authority and none can be above it. we believe that I believe that God is the ultimate authority, not the state. I am under the rules of the state and I will abide by the rules of the state. But these are just diametrically different viewpoints of the world. But I think one of these systems is going to be controlling things. Either it'll be a totalitarian run system or it'll be a democracy, free society oriented system. I had a friend of mine who did run the Tibetan government in exile, and he said either the world will change China or China will change the world. Uh, you're at these fundamentally different types of systems. Uh, One views religious freedom as a foundational right, the other views it as an existential threat. These systems are not going to be able to tolerate each other.
Yeah, peaceful coexistence is not possible according to those terms, right?
It isn't when you've got an ideology, a communist ideology that demands that it must run everything and no authority can be higher than the state, versus a democracy system that says you have the right, you have the human dignity to pick your own ideology of what you believe for as far as the theology of God and your pursuit, or to not pursue it at all, if you so choose.
Yes, and even on that note, as our closing question, then we'll be taking questions from the audience. What would you say? How could you persuade someone who is not religious that nevertheless religious freedom is not only an important human rights issue, but a global security issue?
I think I've covered most of that, Jose, in the sense that it's just this foundational difference. I wish we weren't in these confrontational positions today. I really do. I love China. I've got a daughter that we adopted from China. I love the Chinese people. I love the Chinese culture. Uh, I cannot stand a system that oppresses people as badly as that one does, and has killed more of its own people than any regime in the history of mankind. Um, I, uh, I think in this fight, we've just got to recognize these are fundamentally opposed systems to each other. And at its core is how you view the pursuit of God, whether he even exists, and what freedoms you have in pursuing him. That's at the very core of this division and fight.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback. And please correct me if I'm mistaken, but your book, I believe, is already available for pre-order on Amazon, right?
It is. It
So
is.
I'm going to share the link to it on the chat. So make sure that you get your copy. Um, and now I'd like to open for questions from the audience. So I have two questions here already. The first question is from Joanna. How can we safeguard religious freedom without reducing fundamentally different religious traditions to a single, homogenized framework in the name of neutrality?
I think my view of how religious freedom is operated as a state is that you do everything as the state to protect the fundamental right of religious freedom and to accommodate people's religious beliefs that have difficulty. I helped carry a bill with then junior Senator Chuck Schumer years ago to accommodate Sikhs being able to carry their ceremonial knife into places of work that they were not allowed to. And this is a very important piece of Sikh religion and theology. Um, I think that's how you guarantee it. I'm not a Sikh. I have a lot of respect for people who pursue that faith tradition and the demands of it and pursue the divine that way. But I think that's how the state does it: is we guarantee the right, and then we work as much as we can to accommodate people's religious needs, demands that they may have. That some people can't work on a Saturday. Some don't want to work on a Sunday. I mentioned the Amish example. I think that's how you really embrace the pluralism and maintain the overarching theme of the society of freedom.
Thank you. This is from Anna Carolina. Do you believe that religious freedom can be sustainably promoted from the outside, or does it ultimately depend on internal cultural and institutional developments within each society?
Great question. You know, every all the nations signed the UN Declaration of Human Rights, 1948 UN Charter of Human Rights. Every nation signed that. And Article 18 is the one that they signed on to that says they would guarantee religious freedom for everybody, including the right to pursue faith and including the right to change your faith, including the right publicly or privately to practice your faith. So everybody has signed on to this already. Cultures, particularly I think of like the United States, that ours is just such a diverse culture. We're a nation of nations. We have people from everywhere that are here. So we are always more looking to how do you accommodate. There are other nations that are much more homogenous and less maybe tolerance given to people of a divergent viewpoint or that seek to change out of that. And so it may be harder culturally in places like that for things to happen. I think it's going to take both forces. There's an alliance now of 40, I think it's 8 countries there's an alliance, an International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance of Nations that are coming together to try to promote and to push this together and to push it in other places where it's harder for it to come about. I think that should be pursued. I hope countries on this call will join that International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance to push this fundamental right in places where it's more difficult culturally or governmentally, certainly in some places, for that to happen.
Thank you. We have a question now from one of the co-hosts, Jesus Maria. So he says, first, based on your extensive experience, what are the main differences you see in how freedom of expression is defended and protected between the United States and Europe? So although universal human rights, they are frequently invoked, but there are particular cultural difference among these different countries. So could you please explore that different standards of human rights protection when it comes to freedom of expression and religion that are interconnected?
Yeah. The one I see that comes up most frequently is generally around Islamic or Jewish practices. The Islamic practice of headscarves and the covering, which we allow all this in the United States, but there are certain European countries that don't allow those public expressions that way. And there you're going to hear more of my American bias. I'm kind of going, well, if a person wants to dress this way and it's a part of their deeply held religious beliefs, well, I don't see the harm with this. I may not agree with it. It may not be something that I would practice or would encourage within my own family, but it's part of their belief system, and I want to respect it as I want them to respect my belief system. And I think we are enriched by that practice. I think we're challenged by that practice. But these are things to me that's what you've got court systems in various countries, and you have different ideas. We really got to get the fundamentals right, that person is allowed to practice their faith, they're allowed to practice it publicly, as much as possible within a system. But those can get to be some very touchy constitutional points. Jose, I remember the case you brought up on Brazil while you were a student of mine, where I think the government didn't allow proselytizing among certain tribal areas in Brazil. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, that's my belief is they have a right to know these issues and for people to present that. And the government was saying, no, you can't. Well, okay, now seems to me they have a right to know whatever uh, they should have access to. But those are key ones in Western societies, I think, particularly, and why you need lawyers and also to me why you need a fundamental and robust definition and defense of religious freedom as this foundational right. The other and final point on this, I would say, is that I think these rights need to be broadly interpreted and defended because any ground that we give on religious freedom in the Western societies will be magnified in totalitarian regimes. And they'll say, well, you don't allow this in France, or you don't allow this in Brazil or the United States, when we can go even further with it. It just opens the door for more religious persecution.
Thank you. I believe that Aldir raised his hand. So if you'd like to post your question to the chat or just address the ambassador directly.
O ator Richard Gere, ele teve muita dificuldade quando ele passou a denunciar as violações de direitos humanos na China.
Yeah, so Richard Gere, the actor, he started to face many difficulties when he started to denounce human rights violations in China.
Durante as Olimpíadas de Pequim, em 2008, eu, particularmente, tive dificuldades em publicar artigos sobre violações de direitos humanos na China.
And he's saying that during the Olympic Games in China in 2008, he personally had difficulties publishing articles denouncing human rights violations in China.
Eu havia publicado muitos artigos sobre violações de direitos no Irã e em diversas outras partes do mundo, mas o meu artigo sobre China foi censurado.
So he published about human rights violations pertaining many countries, including Iran, but his article that he wrote on China was censored.
Por coincidência, ontem eu atualizei esse artigo censurado sobre China. E não sei se vou conseguir publicar.
So he said that coincidentally yesterday he updated his article that was censored back in 2008.
A minha pergunta é a seguinte: eu tenho até eu consigo imaginar, calcular alguns motivos dessa dificuldade, mas eu gostaria de saber do nosso convidado, do palestrante, do embaixador, por que nós temos tanta dificuldade de criticar as violações de direitos humanos na China? Essa é a minha pergunta. Obrigado.
Por nada. So he's saying that he has sort of an idea, but why is it the case that it's so difficult to criticize and point out to human rights violations in China, more so than in other countries?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for writing the article and trying to get it published. And yeah, Richard Gere was censored by Hollywood. And the last time a major Hollywood studio did a film critical of China was 1997 with 7 Years in Tibet and Richard Gere. And Hollywood hasn't been critical since, and China is doing 3 genocides right now against religious minorities: the Uyghur Muslim minority, the Tibetan Buddhist, cultural genocide, and the Falun Gong practitioners. I think it's so hard because China is so big and so aggressive in pushing back. Other places don't push back, aren't as integrated in the global economy, whereas China is vastly integrated in the global economy. And President Trump was, I would say, the first president to be openly critical of China since John Kennedy. Nixon Did détente and opened up? And since then, there really been no, it's been this sort of, we want China to develop, and when it develops and connects with the Western system, it'll become more like it. And that didn't happen. It just took the money and built warships. So I think it's their aggressive tactics that they use. Obviously, I'm banned in China personally. Um, and I think you're going to see that in this confrontation with China as it gets more pointed, uh, that you're going to see really probably these Western and China-based economies break apart, and countries increasingly have to determine, do they want to operate in the Chinese sphere economically, globally, internet-wise, or do they want to operate in the Western sphere?
So I'd like to give the word to Jim Kelly now.
Thank you very much, Jose. I appreciate it. And I just wanted to weigh in to give a individual and group thanks to Ambassador Brownback. I don't think there is a person on the planet, maybe it's a handful of people on the planet that have done more during the course of their career to advance the cause of international religious freedom, and also just the incredible career he's had as a civil servant, uh, governor of Arkansas, House of Representatives, United States Senator, ambassador. It's been a magnificent career, and humanity owes you a great debt of gratitude. I want to put it in the context of something that Jacques Maritain said. He developed principles for a heroic democracy, and he talked about prophets of the people. And I believe Ambassador Brownback is a prophet of the people. Maritain said prophets are needed to awaken the people as to their civic duties. In periods of crisis, prophets are often found among those spiritual individuals who, finding things as they are intolerable, simply refuse to accept the status quo. Uh, Ambassador Brownback, you're a prophet of the people. You were a visionary on the topic of international religious liberty, and we thank you very much for that.
So it's a very high words, and I'm humbled that you would look at it that way. But I'm deeply appreciative. This book has been a calling. This work has been a calling for years, and and you wish the world was not this way. I don't like doing this. I'm not a naturally confrontational person, but it is this way. And at some point in time, you just got to say no, no more. In the book, we feature 9 different individuals from various faiths and their personal persecution journey and story. One was a nursing mother who had one of her nursing children killed. One was a woman, Falun Gong practitioner, who had her husband killed. All have suffered torment incredibly. And we do it of all these different faiths to show this isn't just the CCP picking on Christians or Muslims. This is a worldview that they have to enforce to maintain control. And if we want that to be imposed on the world, then let's just keep sailing the way we're sailing. And you're going, no, I don't want that for my children. I don't want that route. And so you end up in a confrontational point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to highlight that Ambassador Brownback has been extremely generous with his time. And I know that there are still a couple of questions left on the chat. I'll make sure to copy these questions, forward them to Ambassador Brownback. But as of now, we're going to have to finish the interview. Okay. So once again, thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback.